In 15 minutes on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, more Japanese soldiers died in the water than Americans had died at Pearl Harbor. They died off the coast of New Guinea in a stretch of ocean called the Bismarck Sea. They died because a 52-year-old admiral named Masatomi Kimura believed something that was no longer true. He believed the sea belonged to Japan. 2,000 miles to the south, in a corrugated iron shed outside Brisbane, Australia, a 43-year-old American mechanic was about to prove him wrong. His name was Paul Gunn. His wife and 4 children were at that moment starving in a Japanese prison camp in Manila. And he had spent the last 7 months bolting 8 machine guns into the nose of an airplane that was never supposed to have any. This is the story of how a mechanic's grief, a general's willingness to listen, and 15 minutes of gunfire changed the Pacific War forever. The convoy left Rabaul at midnight on the 1st of March, 1943. Rear Admiral Kimura stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki and watched 8 transport ships slide out of Simpson Harbor into the dark. He was a career officer. His skin was weathered by 2 decades of tropical sun, and he had been given a mission that most of his fellow admirals had already refused. 6,900 men waited on those transports. They belonged to the 51st Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, and they had been promised to Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, whose garrison at Lae, on the eastern coast of New Guinea, was slowly starving. Some of the soldiers had been at Rabaul for 6 weeks, waiting for the weather. Some of them wrote letters home that night. Some of them prayed. Most of them slept. Kimura studied the harbor and counted his escorts, 8 destroyers. That was his shield. He had also been promised air cover from Rabaul's fighter squadrons, though the number of Zeros available on any given hour was closer to 40 than the 100 his officers whispered about. Kimura knew the truth. He had commanded destroyers at Guadalcanal, and he had learned that promises made on paper rarely survived the sea. Still, he had reasons to believe. American high-altitude bombers had been trying to hit Japanese ships for over a year, and their record was almost comical. Bombs fell from 20,000 feet and vanished harmlessly into empty water. Ships zigzagged and lived. The Imperial Navy's doctrine had been built around this fact. The umbrella of anti-aircraft steel worked. It always worked. Kimura did not know, could not know, what had been happening in a corrugated iron shed outside Brisbane for the past 7 months. At a place called Eagle Farm Airfield, a lean man in a stained mechanic's coverall was arguing with the war. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn. He was 43 years old. His hair was going grey at the temples, and his face was creased with the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can repair. In the United States Navy, where he had served for 21 years, he had been a chief petty officer and a naval aviator. In the Army Air Forces, where he now wore a major's silver oak leaves, he was called Pappy. He hated the nickname. He kept it because it hurt less than the truth. The truth was this. On December 8, 1941, when Japanese bombers appeared over Nichols Field near Manila, Paul Gunn had been on the ground, watching them come. His wife, Polly, and their 4 children, Nathalie and Julie, and Paul Jr. and Connie, had been at their home in the Philippines. He had put them there. He had brought them from the safety of the United States because he loved them and could not bear to be apart from them. And now, because of that love, they were prisoners. The Japanese had swept through Manila within weeks. Polly and the 4 children had been herded, with thousands of other American civilians, into the internment camp at Santo Tomas University. Paul Gunn had flown south with the shattered remnants of the Far East Air Force, and every night since, in every bunk, in every base from Darwin to Port Moresby, he had lain awake thinking about a wall. The wall was in a workshop at Eagle Farm. It was where he pinned his tools. Behind the tools, out of sight, he kept a small photograph. He did not need to look at it. He knew every face. He worked, instead, He worked until his hands cramped and his eyes burned, and the mechanics under him begged him to sleep. He worked because the only way he could survive the thought of his family was to build something that would kill the men who had taken them. In August of 1942, a small, sharp-eyed general named George Kenney arrived in Australia to take command of what would become the 5th Air Force. Kenney was 53 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and he had a reputation for two things. He got results, and he did not care how. Within days of his arrival, Kenney had toured the maintenance depots. At Eagle Farm, he found Pappy gun covered in oil. Welding gun mounts into the nose of an A-20 Havoc without authorization from any manual, any engineer, or any bureaucrat in Washington. Another commander might have court-martialed him. Kenney watched for several minutes in silence. Then he asked Gunn what he was doing. Gunn told him he was ripping the useless bombardier's compartment out of light bombers and stuffing the space with forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. He explained that a bomber that could not hit a moving ship from altitude might be able to kill it from 50 feet. He explained that if you put enough guns in the nose of an airplane, you could suppress a destroyer's anti-aircraft crews long enough to place a bomb into her hull. He explained all of this in the flat, tired voice of a man who had said it too many times to too many officers who would not listen. Kenney listened. When Gunn finished, the general said only one thing: "Keep going, that was the beginning." By late 1942, Gunn had a partner. His name was Jack Fox, and he was a civilian technical representative from North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25 Mitchell. Fox was thin and quiet and about 35 years old, and he had come to Australia to service airplanes and had ended up rebuilding them. Together, Gunn and Fox began work on a machine that no factory in America had yet imagined. They took a B-25C-1 medium bomber. They removed the bombardier's station in the transparent nose. They removed the ventral turret. They removed anything that did not shoot forward. Into the nose, they installed 450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, and then, when 4 seemed insufficient, they installed 4 more. 8 guns in the nose of a bomber, 2,000 rounds of ammunition per barrel. A weight redistribution problem that nearly broke the aircraft in half the first time they tried to fly it. They compensated. They added lead weights to the tail. They reinforced the nose structure with steel plates cannibalized from wrecks. They rerouted hydraulic lines and rewired firing solenoids so that a single pilot, alone at the controls, could unleash all 8 guns with the twitch of a thumb. The result, when it was finished, could throw roughly 6,800 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary at a target every 60 seconds. It was not a bomber anymore, it was a saw. Kenney's other favorite officer in that same season was a young major named William Benn. Benn was 32 years old. He had thick eyebrows, a quick laugh, and an obsession that had begun with a report he had read months earlier about British experiments with bouncing bombs against European canal locks. The British experiments were early, secret, and only partially successful, but Benn had taken the underlying idea, the physics of a heavy object skipping across water like a flat stone, and he had brought it to the Pacific. He began practicing in September of 1942. He used the rusted, half-sunk hulk of a merchant ship called the SS Pruth, wrecked on a coral reef near Port Moresby, as his target. He flew a B-17 Flying Fortress in low over the water at 200 feet, released a 500-pound bomb, and watched as it skipped once, twice, 3 times before slamming into the wreck's hull. He did this again and again, adjusting his altitude and speed and release point until he could put a bomb into a ship's side almost every time. Benn called the technique skip bombing. He wrote it up in a training manual and taught it to pilots in the 63rd Bombardment Squadron. And Kenney, watching from Brisbane, understood immediately what he had. He had a mechanic in Australia building airplanes that could suppress anti-aircraft fire from wave-top height. He had a pilot in New Guinea teaching men how to place bombs into moving hulls from that same altitude. If those two ideas could be married, the Japanese merchant marine would cease to exist. On the 18th of January, 1943, William Benn took off in a B-17 to conduct a lone reconnaissance flight over the north coast of New Guinea. He did not return. Search flights combed the mountains and the jungle for weeks. Nothing was found, no wreckage, no bodies. No transmissions. William Benn, the man who had taught the 5th Air Force how to skip a bomb across the sea, was simply gone. The war swallowed him. The men in his squadron went silent for a day. Then they went back to work. There was a promotion and a change of command, and the training that Benn had begun continued under other hands. His skip bombing technique passed to a young officer named Ed Larner, who commanded the 90th Bombardment Squadron, the unit that flew Pappy guns modified B-25s. Larner was 27 years old. He was tall, aggressive, and unafraid, to a degree that his friends found alarming. He had inherited two things at once. He had inherited Benn's tactic, and he had inherited Gunn's weapon. And in his mind, all through the second half of January and into February, he began to imagine what those two inheritances could do together. By the last week of February 1943, the pieces were in place. Pappy guns modified B-25s, 12 of them, sat in revetments at Port Moresby. Their 8-gun noses were painted flat olive. Their crews had trained for weeks, flying practice runs against target sleds towed behind boats in the Coral Sea. The Australian squadrons, particularly the Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron RAAF, had rehearsed alongside them until the timing of the coordinated attack was as precise as a piece of music. Kenney had received the intelligence. Ultra-intercepts, decoded from Japanese naval traffic, had told him that a major convoy was preparing to sail from Rabaul to Lae. He knew the size, he knew the escorts, he knew the departure window. He had 5 days to prepare. He gave the order on February 27th. At Port Moresby, in a briefing room lit by naked bulbs, Ed Larner stood in front of his pilots and told them what they were about to do. He told them the height at which they would attack, 100 feet. He told them the range at which they would open fire, 1,500 yards. He told them the moment at which they would release their bombs, 600 yards from the target, with delay fuses set to 5 seconds. He did not tell them how many of them would die. That same evening in Rabaul, Rear Admiral Kimura sat in his cabin aboard the destroyer Shirayuki and reviewed the manifest of the convoy he would soon command. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, 6,900 soldiers of the 51st Division. On the bridge of the transport Teiyo Maru, a 22-year-old infantry private from Kochi Prefecture was writing a letter home to his mother. He wrote that he was well. He wrote that the ship was crowded, but that the officers had promised them a short voyage. He wrote that he expected to be at Lae within a few days, and that his mother should not worry. He did not know that in Australia, an American mechanic was cleaning the barrels of 8 50 caliber machine guns and thinking about his wife. He did not know that in Port Moresby, an American pilot was memorizing the silhouette of the ship on which he was about to sleep. He did not know that in Brisbane, an American general was signing orders that would kill him. The convoy would sail at dawn. The saw was ready. The convoy sailed from Rabaul at midnight. On the 1st of March, 1943, there was no moon. The transports moved out of Simpson Harbour in a line, low and heavy in the water, and the 8 destroyers wheeled into position around them like sheepdogs around a flock. The ships steamed east first, then curved north around the tip of New Britain, staying close to the coast where a weather front hung low over the sea and shrouded them in rain and cloud. Kimura had chosen the route deliberately. He had studied the American reconnaissance patterns for weeks. He knew that the storm front stretching down from New Britain into the Bismarck Sea would blind the enemy's eyes. He believed he could hide his ships inside the weather for 2 full days, and by the time the skies cleared, the convoy would be within range of the fighter cover, flying out of Lae itself. It was a good plan. It was the plan of a professional. In another war, in another year, it might have worked. But on the afternoon of the 1st of March, in a small break in the clouds 200 miles north of New Britain, an American B-24 Liberator crossed the sky. The pilot was Lieutenant Walter Higgins. He was 24 years old, tired, and half an hour from turning back to base. He looked down through the ragged edge of a cloud and saw them, 16 dark shapes on grey water, wakes like knife cuts. He counted them twice. He radioed Port Moresby. He gave the coordinates, then he turned for home. At Port Moresby, the message reached Kenney's staff within the hour. The convoy had been found. The clock had started. That night, in the ready rooms and the mess halls and the tents where the crews slept, the men of the 5th Air Force were told. Some of them wrote letters, some of them did not. Ed Larner, the 27-year-old commander of the 90th Bombardment Squadron, walked out to the flight line in the dark and stood alone beside his B-25 for a long time. The airplane was called Ruthless. The nose was black with the shadows of 8 machine gun barrels. Larner did not touch the airplane. He only looked at it. Then he went back to his tent and he slept, or pretended to. At dawn on the 2nd of March, the sky over the Bismarck Sea opened just enough. 8 B-17 flying fortresses of the 63rd Squadron, flying at 7,000 feet, found the convoy through a break in the weather and began their bomb runs. From the decks of the transports, the Japanese soldiers saw them coming, high and glinting in the morning sun, and they watched the small dark shapes fall from the bomb bays and drift down through the air. Most of the bombs missed. This was expected, this was the pattern of the war, but one of them did not miss. The transport Kyokusei Maru took a direct hit amidships. She had been carrying over 1,200 soldiers. The bomb tore through her deck and exploded in the forward hold. She burned for less than an hour before she rolled and went down. The destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo moved in to rescue the survivors, and by afternoon they had pulled roughly 800 men from the water. The 2 destroyers then broke away from the convoy at high speed, racing ahead to deliver the rescued troops directly to Lae. They arrived that night. They unloaded the men. Then they turned around and sailed back to rejoin the convoy. Those 800 soldiers were the only reinforcements that would ever reach Lieutenant General Adachi. The men who saved them were about to survive. The men who had missed the rescue, still on the transports behind them, were about to die. Aboard the transport, Teiyo Maru, the young private from Kochi, watched the smoke of Kyokusei Maru's sinking rise on the horizon. He was 22 years old. He had never seen a ship sink before. He had never seen a man die. He held onto the ship's rail with both hands, and he could not stop shaking. And beside him, a sergeant told him to stop being a child, and he tried, and he could not. That night, the officers came through the crowded holds and told the soldiers that the Americans had lost their chance. The weather was closing back in. The convoy was almost within range of the Zeros from Lae. By tomorrow evening, they would be safe on land. Private lay in his hammock in the dark and listened to the engines throb through the steel of the hull. He thought about his mother's garden. He thought about the smell of rice cooking. He fell asleep sometime after midnight. He would wake to the sound of aircraft engines at 10 in the morning. Kenney did not sleep on the night of the 2nd. He stood over the maps at Port Moresby and he made his decision. Every airplane he had, every squadron, every crew. The full weight of the 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force delivered in one coordinated blow from 3 altitudes at once at 10 in the morning on the 3rd of March. The plan was layered. At the top 7,000 feet, 13 B-17 flying fortresses would begin the attack with high-altitude bombing. Their real job was not to hit anything. Their real job was to make every Japanese anti-aircraft gunner in the convoy tilt his weapon upward and stare into the sun. At the middle, 2,200 feet, 13 Australian Beaufighters of No. 30 Squadron would come in from the southwest. Long-nosed, cannon-armed, brutally fast, the Beaufighters would drop to wave top height in the final seconds of their approach and rake the destroyers and transports with 20mm fire. And below them, at 100 feet, the 12 B-25 Mitchells of Ed Larner's 90th Squadron would come in last. Each of them carried 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in the nose. Each of them carried 3,000 pounds of 500 bombs, fitted with 5-second delay fuses. They would fly at 280 miles per hour, 100 feet above the sea, straight at the sides of the ships. And they would not stop. 10 o'clock came clear. The young private was on the deck of Teiyo Maru when the alarm sounded. He heard the roar first, high above, and he looked up and saw the tiny silver crosses of the B-17s. He watched the Japanese gunners around him swing their 25mm cannons upward and begin to fire. The tracers reached up into the blue. The gunners shouted at each other. Someone laughed. Someone slapped him on the back and told him to watch. Because the American cowards were going to bomb from a mile up and hit nothing again. He did not see the other airplanes. He did not see them because they were coming out of the southwest at the exact height of the wavetops, so low that the salt spray beaded on their windscreens. The Beaufighters came first, 13 of them abreast, and they came in silent to the ears of the men on the ships because the sound of their engines had not yet arrived. On the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki, a lookout saw them at last and cried out. But he did not cry out that they were Beaufighters. He cried out that they were Beauforts, Beaufort torpedo bombers. That mistake killed them. Japanese naval doctrine, drilled into every officer, said that when torpedo bombers approached, the ship must turn her bow directly toward the attacking aircraft to present the narrowest possible target to the incoming torpedo. And so, when the cry of Beauforts went up along the convoy, ship after ship after ship began to swing her bow around toward the southwest. Toward the attackers, toward the guns. The Beaufighters, of course, were not carrying torpedoes. The Beaufighters were carrying 4 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns in their noses. And they were now looking down the long, narrow decks of Japanese warships that had turned themselves into perfect targets, bow to stern for aircraft firing straight ahead. The first burst of Beaufighter cannon fire tore into the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki at 10:03 in the morning. Kimura, standing on the bridge wing, was thrown against the bulkhead by the shock of the impact. The bridge glass shattered around him. His signalman went down without a sound. The captain of the ship, standing beside him a moment before, was gone. And then the second wave came. Ed Larner brought his B-25 down toward the confused wake of Shirayuki at 100 feet. Ruthless was doing 280 miles per hour. The engines shook the airframe. The 8 guns in the nose sat cold and dark in their mounts, waiting. Larner's thumb rested on the firing button. His eyes were fixed on Shirayuki. He could see men running on the deck. He could see the tracers still climbing upward at the B-17s, oblivious. At 1,500 yards, he pressed the button. 8 50-caliber machine guns fired at once. The recoil hammered the nose of the airplane back into Larner's spine. 6,800 rounds per minute poured out of Ruthless in a single unbroken stream, and every 5th round was tracer, and every 2nd round was armor-piercing incendiary, and the space between the airplane and the destroyer became a solid rope of light. The rope reached Shirayuki's bridge. The bridge did not have time to explode. The bridge disassembled. The steel of the superstructure came apart in flakes. the gun tubs behind the bridge, where Kimura's anti-aircraft crews were still trying to depress their guns to meet this new low-altitude threat, filled with a fire so bright it looked white. Men who had been standing at their guns a second before were simply not there anymore. Kimura himself, thrown to the deck by the first burst, crawled across broken glass and pieces of the signalman and did not look at what he was crawling through. Larner held the trigger down for 6 seconds. In 6 seconds, he fired 600 rounds. Then he pickled his bombs. The two 500-pounders left the bomb bay at exactly 600 yards from Shirayuki's hull. They struck the water once, skipped, struck it again, skipped a second time, and slammed into the destroyer's flank just below the waterline. The 5-second delay fuses did their work. The bombs exploded inside the ship. Shirayuki broke. The blast cracked her keel forward of the aft turret. Her stern lifted. Her bow drove down into the sea. She began to die within 30 seconds of Larner passing over her. Behind Larner, the other B-25s of the Mthnith squadron were choosing their targets. Lieutenant John Henebry was 24 years old. He was flying a B-25 named the Notre Dame de Victoire, though everyone in the squadron called it the Hag. He picked the transport Teiyo Maru because she was the largest ship still moving, and he brought the Hag down to 80 feet and lined up on her port beam. On the deck of Teiyo Maru, the young private from Kochi saw the airplane coming. He would remember for the rest of his life that it did not look like an airplane. It looked like a shape made of noise. The noise arrived before the shape did, a shrieking mechanical howl that filled the sky, and then the shape came out of the howl, low over the water, with 8 small suns burning in its face. The 8 small suns were the muzzle flashes of Henebry's guns. The private threw himself flat on the deck. The man beside him, a sergeant, did not. The sergeant was reaching for a rifle when the first burst of 50 caliber fire crossed the deck of Teiyo Maru at chest height. The rounds walked across the ship from bow to stern in less than 3 seconds. The private felt the deck plates jump beneath him. Something wet struck the side of his face. He did not look. He crawled. He crawled toward the rail because the rail was the only direction he could think of. When Henebry's bombs hit, the Hag was already climbing away. The bombs skipped once and drove into Teiyo Maru's midships. The ship convulsed. A wall of flame rose out of the forward cargo hatch, where the ammunition had been stored, and the deck plating beneath the private's belly tilted upward like the lid of a box being opened. He fell into the sea. The killing continued for 15 minutes. Lieutenant Roy Moore, in a B-25 called Chatterbox, attacked the transport Oigawa Maru from the beam. His 8 guns caught the ship broadside. His skip bombs broke her hull. She sank in under 12 minutes. Lieutenant Charles Howe attacked the destroyer Arashio, whose captain had bravely turned his warship broadside to shield the transports behind him. Howe's guns and bombs left Arashio a burning, drifting hulk. She collided with the transport Nojima in her death throes. The 2 ships locked together and burned as one. Behind them, Beaufighters raked the survivors. Behind the Beaufighters, more B-17s came in with more bombs. And behind all of them, an entire second wave of 5th Air Force aircraft, another 60 airplanes, was already climbing out of Port Moresby to finish what the first wave had started. By 10:20 in the morning, 37 minutes after the first burst of Larner's guns, 7 of the 8 transports were sinking, burning, or already gone. Only Nojima was still afloat, and she was locked to the corpse of a destroyer. Kimura's flagship Shirayuki had broken in half. The destroyer Arashio was dying. The destroyer Tokitsukaze had taken bombs amidships and was going down. The destroyer Asashio was hit repeatedly by strafing runs and finally exploded when a bomb reached her magazines. Kimura himself was pulled off the wreck of Shirayuki by a whaleboat from the destroyer Shikinami. He transferred his flag. He was still alive. He was 52 years old, and he had just watched, in a quarter of an hour, the largest single loss of Japanese soldiers to air attack in the history of the Pacific War. He would not sleep that night. He would not sleep for many nights. In the water, the young private from Kochi was still alive. He had come up under a slick of burning fuel oil, and he had gone back down, and he had come up again in a clear patch, and he had grabbed onto a floating deck plank. He was burned along his left arm. He could not feel his left leg. He held onto the plank and he watched, from 3 feet above the surface of the Bismarck Sea, the last minutes of Teiyo Maru. She rolled onto her side at 10:31. She showed him her keel. Men were still climbing on the keel when she went under. The private saw one man, an officer in a white uniform, kneel on the ship's flank as she rolled and bow his head. He did not know who the officer was. He watched the man vanish beneath the water without moving. Then the private was alone with the plank. There were other men in the water, hundreds, perhaps 1,000. They shouted to each other in the smoke. Some had life jackets. Some had rafts. Some had nothing at all. And after a while, the shouting began to organize itself. The living began to move toward the rafts. The senior officers, those who had survived, began to count their men. The private kicked toward a cluster of survivors and reached them at last, and a hand pulled him halfway onto a broken piece of hatch cover, and he lay there gasping, while a corporal beside him wept without sound. The Bismarck Sea was warm. The air smelled of oil and burned meat. Above them, the last American airplanes were climbing away to the south, growing small in the sky. He thought it was over. It was not over. The next day, the 4th of March, the American airplanes came back. They came back to the same patch of ocean, where the rafts and the men and the pieces of ships still floated in the sun. And they came down low, and they opened fire. The orders had come from Kenney. They had been given verbally, without paper. They said that the men in the water were reinforcements for New Guinea. They said that any man who reached the jungle would fight there and would kill American soldiers there and would have to be killed again at greater cost. They said the war did not stop because a man had lost his ship. Not every pilot obeyed. John Henebry, in his memoirs decades later, would write that he flew over the survivors on the 4th of March and could not bring himself to fire. Some of his fellow pilots did fire. Other pilots of the 90th Squadron led strafing runs against lifeboats and rafts. And PT boats, the fast American motor torpedo boats out of Tufi, moved through the debris fields and finished the work. They came alongside rafts and they used their machine guns. They pulled a small number of Japanese officers out of the water alive for interrogation. The rest they left behind. The historians would argue about this for 80 years. Some would call it a war crime. Some would call it a hard necessity. Some would refuse to look at it at all. But no one who fought at Bismarck ever forgot what happened on the 4th and 5th of March, 1943. The young private did not die in the water. He was picked up on the night of the 5th by a Japanese submarine dispatched from Rabaul to rescue survivors under cover of darkness. He was one of about 2,700 men eventually returned to Rabaul out of the 6,900 who had sailed. He would go home, eventually, to Kochi Prefecture. He would live to be an old man, and he would never again in his life stand on a beach without looking at the sky first. On the evening of the 5th of March, in his headquarters at Port Moresby, General George Kenney signed the after-action report and had a drink and slept for the first time in 4 days. In Brisbane, in a workshop at Eagle Farm, Pappy Gunn heard the news of the Bismarck Sea action on the radio. He read the initial reports the next morning. He did not celebrate. He walked out to the flight line and he ran his hand along the nose of a new B-25 that was being modified. He thought about a wall 2,000 miles to the north. He went back inside, picked up a wrench, and got back to work. The saw would keep cutting. 2 days after the last body sank into the Bismarck Sea, in a room in Tokyo lined with maps and lit by a single desk lamp, the Imperial General Headquarters made a decision that would help lose the war. They forbade the use of large transport ships to reinforce Lae. From this point forward, they ruled men and supplies bound for New Guinea would travel only by submarine or by small barge, moving at night in numbers that could never replace what had been lost. The decision was necessary. It was also fatal. An empire built on distant islands cannot be sustained a barge at a time. At Lae, Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi read the order in silence. He was 53 years old, a soldier of the old school, and he understood exactly what he had been handed. His division, waiting for the 6,900 men who would never come, would now hold their ground with what they had. Which was very little, which was already running out. Over the following 6 months, Adachi's soldiers ate their supply of rice, and then they ate their pack animals, and then they ate their leather belts. When they were finally ordered to evacuate Lae in September of 1943, they did not have ships, they had their boots. They walked. They walked north into the Finisterre Mountains, through a jungle that killed men with fevers and leeches and rain that never stopped. Thousands of them died on the trail without ever seeing an American soldier. Their bones are still in that jungle today. The Bismarck Sea action, which had lasted 15 minutes in the sky, took nearly a year to finish killing men on the ground. In April of 1943, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, ordered a massive aerial counteroffensive to restore Japanese momentum in the South Pacific. He called it Operation Igo. It threw hundreds of aircraft against American positions in the Solomons and New Guinea. It achieved almost nothing. Yamamoto flew forward to Rabaul to inspect the results. On the 18th of April, 1943, 7 weeks after Bismarck, his airplane was shot down over Bougainville by American P-38 Lightnings that had been guided to him by codebreakers. He was 59 years old. He died in the jungle, still strapped in his seat. Japan did not announce his death for over a month. There is no evidence that Yamamoto's decision to fly forward was directly caused by Bismarck. But the war he was flying into, the war he was trying to hold together, was the war that Kenney's B-25s had rewritten in 15 minutes on the 3rd of March. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura survived the sea. He returned to Japan. He was not court-martialed. He was not publicly disgraced. The Imperial Navy, protective of its officer corps and desperate to hide the scale of the disaster from the Japanese public, quietly reassigned him to shore duty and training commands. He never again commanded a combat force at sea. He lived through the rest of the war. He lived through the occupation. He lived, in fact, until 1960, 17 years after the Bismarck Sea, and he died of natural causes in a small house near Tokyo. What he thought about in the mornings in those 17 years, no one has ever recorded. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoirs. The last man who had watched an entire division die from the bridge of a burning destroyer took his silence with him into the ground. Ed Larner, the young major who had led the 12 B-25s into the convoy, did not survive the year. On the 28th of April, 1943, 8 weeks after Bismarck, Larner was flying a routine mission in a BT-5 called Spook 2 near Dobadura, on the north coast of New Guinea. His aircraft went down. There was no enemy contact. The weather was clear. The airplane, heavy in the nose with 8 machine guns and their ammunition, struck the ground and killed everyone aboard. He was 27 years old. Some investigators later suggested that the weight distribution of the Strafer modification, the very configuration that had made the airplane so deadly at Bismarck, had contributed to its instability in the crash. It was never proven. It did not need to be. The war did not require proof to take a man. It only required his name. Larner was buried in New Guinea. His squadron flew his empty airplane slot for one mission and then filled it with a replacement and kept working. The saw kept cutting. By the middle of 1943, the 5th Air Force had 3 full bombardment groups converted to Strafer configuration. In August, the 345th Bombardment Group, calling themselves the Air Apaches and painting sharks' teeth on their noses, arrived in theater with brand-new B-25s. In November, they helped tear apart the Japanese anchorage at Rabaul in a single afternoon. By 1944, the factory in Kansas City was building B-25J models with 12 to 18 forward-firing machine guns as standard equipment. Pappy Gunn's field modification had become the airplane. Japanese daylight shipping in the South Pacific effectively ended. Merchant tonnage collapsed. Garrisons on distant islands began to starve, and in classified reports written for internal use, Japanese naval staff began to describe the American Strafer bomber as the single most feared weapon in the theater. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, later wrote in his memoirs that the loss of maritime supply, the slow strangulation of the Outer Empire, had done more to defeat Japan than the atomic bombs. That strangulation had a starting point. It had a date. It was the 3rd of March, 1943. Pappy Gunn worked through the rest of the war. He was promoted. He was wounded. He was hospitalized. He got out of the hospital and went back to his workshop. He designed new modifications, new gun packages, new methods of killing ships and airplanes and men. He became something of a legend within the 5th Air Force, a rumpled, foul-mouthed major whom generals listened to and factories obeyed. And every night when the war let him, he thought about a wall in Manila. In February of 1945, American troops broke into the internment camp at Santo Tomas University. They found Polly Gunn and Natalie and Julie and Paul Jr. and Connie alive, emaciated, sick, but alive. Pappy Gunn flew into Manila the day after they were freed. He walked through the gate of Santo Tomas in his flight suit, and his wife, who had not seen him in 3 years and 2 months, saw him coming across the courtyard. And she walked to meet him, and they stopped in front of each other, and neither of them said anything for a long time. He had built airplanes for this moment. He had welded steel and drawn diagrams, and killed men from Australia to the Philippines for this moment. And in the moment itself, he could not speak. He simply stood in the courtyard of a prison camp and held his family. He got them home. He kept working. The war ended in August of 1945. Paul Irvin Gunn survived it. He stayed in the Philippines after the surrender and went back into civil aviation, flying commercial routes across the islands where he had once fought. His wife, Polly, stayed with him. The children grew up. The years passed. On the 11th of October, 1957, Pappy Gunn was flying a small commercial airplane through a storm near Manila when he lost control in bad weather. The airplane went down. He was 62 years old. He had survived the Japanese, the .50 caliber, the war, the years, and he was killed by bad weather in the country he had spent his life trying to reach. The family he had welded steel for had come home, and then the man who had welded the steel had gone. The B-25 Strafer became the ancestor of every armed gunship in the American arsenal, the AC-47 Spooky over the Mekong Delta in 1965. The AC-130 Spectre over Cambodia and Kuwait and Afghanistan, the A-10 Warthog with its 30mm cannon over the deserts of Iraq. All of them, in a real sense, are grandchildren of 850 caliber machine guns bolted into the nose of a B-25 by a mechanic in Brisbane who could not sleep because of what had been done to his family. The idea outlived the man. The idea always outlives the man. 6,900 Japanese soldiers sailed from Rabaul on the 28th of February, 1943. Approximately 2,700 of them were rescued from the sea and returned to Rabaul. Approximately 1,200, mostly the survivors of Kyokusei Maru, actually reached Lae, and most of them died in the jungle within the year. The remaining 3,000 died in the water, or on the burning transports, or beneath the guns of aircraft that came back on the 4th and 5th of March, to finish what had been started on the 3rd. They died because a mechanic in Australia would not sleep. They died because a general in Brisbane was willing to listen to a mechanic. They died because a young major in Port Moresby was willing to fly at 100 feet directly into the faces of their guns. They died because the American war machine, unlike almost any other in history, was willing to let creative men break the rules and see what happened. They died, in the end, because their empire had built itself out of ships, and someone had finally figured out how to cut ships in half. 15 minutes, one dawn over the Bismarck Sea. The saw had cut deeper than anyone knew,